When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
I'm Scott Hansen, host of NFL Red Zone. Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. That's why we're here to help you get your next DIY project done, even when the clock isn't on your side. Whether that's a new Filtrete filter or Bosch and Cobalt power tools, Lowe's has everything you need to feel like the MVP of DIY. So get it done and earn your Sunday. Shop now, in-store and online. Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. And as this is an episode of our special Vice Presidency series, I am joined by my better half and co-host, Alex. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
So, Alex, it's been a bit since we recorded, but do you remember who the last person that we discussed was?
Okay, let me think about this for a minute.
Now, I know he's not quite that memorable, but do you remember anything about our last person discussed?
John Galliard was his name.
Yes.
He was a very admirable man from what I remember. Did what he was supposed to do. No major scandals from what I remember. But that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was a president pro tem.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we mentioned in that episode that even though finally in 1817 there was a new vice president able to take up the role of president of the Senate, Galliard would be called on numerous times during that person's tenure to serve as president pro tem to fill in for him. We're going to find out why today, because we're going to be talking about that vice president, Daniel D. Tompkins. So do you know anything about Daniel D. Tompkins before we...
Well, I did a quick read, and he was from New York, has a few streets named after his children on Staten Island, graduated from Columbia College, I believe it was, and I think he was the first VP to serve both full terms in full.
Yes.
That's pretty much the synopsis, and a couple of other things, which I'm sure we'll discuss more today.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you mentioned those streets on Staten Island. We will get to that too.
Oh, very interesting.
So to get us started, you already mentioned Daniel D. Tompkins was born on June 21st, 1774 at Fox Meadow, which is modern-day Scarsdale, New York. He was the 8th child out of what would ultimately be either 11 or 12 kids. There's a little confusion about that were born to Jonathan Griffin and Sarah Ann Hyatt Tompkins.
When it comes to what your family eats and drinks, you know your choices matter. You're the expert because you know what fits your life. And getting it right starts with good information. That's why America's beverage companies are sharing more information about our ingredients at goodtoknowfacts.org. No spin, no judgments, just the facts straight from the experts for more than 140 beverage ingredients. Visit goodtoknowfacts.org.
Now, his family history doesn't go too far back, but we know that one of his paternal ancestors came from England with 2 brothers, and the trio purchased most of what became the town of Eastchester. His grandfather owned a farm bordering the Long Island Sound before moving to White Plains, which was where his father was born. Tompkins' father served as an indentured servant to Captain Jonathan Griffin from the age of 4 until he was 21 to learn about farming, and he lived in Griffin's home for most of his apprenticeship. And thus he changed his name to pay homage to Griffin when he was old enough. Tompkins' mother's family, that side of the family, was originally from Scotland, and Jonathan and Sarah married in 1755, moving to a cabin in the Fox Meadow region. Their first child, Caleb, was born in 1759, and the remainder were born at regular intervals for the next 23 years.
Good grief.
Yeah. So 1755 was the first. 1774 was when Tompkins, who was the 8th child, was born. So that's a long time of having kids.
Good night. Yeah, I can't imagine.
Now, in the same year of Daniel's birth, Jonathan Griffin Tompkins gained uncontested title to their farm in 1774, which put the family on a firmer financial footing than most of their neighbors. And his father became a leader in the community, getting involved in debates, both of a local nature and the larger conflict between the colonies and the British government. Jonathan took the side of the colonists and thus was ready to actively participate in the Patriot cause after the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. Among other posts, Daniel's father worked his way up to serve in the 3rd and 4th Provincial Congresses of New York and in the state convention that adopted both the Declaration of Independence and the state constitution before serving in the new state legislature. Jonathan Griffin Tompkins also served in the Middle Battalion of Westchester County. The war years would prove difficult for the family, as the area at the time was described by Tompkins' biographer Irwin as, quote, a middle ground where opposing armies tramped and fought, where prowling marauders terrified the inhabitants. Scenes of desolation became common. Homes were abandoned, farms went out of cultivation, and livestock disappeared as the fearful left the county. Those who remained regarded their neighbors with suspicion. After the Battle of White Plains in October 1776, Jonathan decided to move his family to Dutchess County, where they remained for the rest of the war. Now, naturally, Daniel was too young to remember much about the early days of the war, but he would recall the return to their home at Fox Meadow when he was 9 years old. Now, upon their return, Jonathan resumed holding public office, becoming the supervisor of the town of Scarsdale in 1783, a post that he was reelected to annually until 1792 when he became a county judge. Jonathan also continued to serve in the state legislature and pushed the cause of education in that body. And in 1787, he became a member of the Board of Regents for a newly created state university. So, his father's doing pretty well for himself.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
In September 1787, Daniel was enrolled in a grammar school in New York City run by a graduate of St. Andrews in Scotland.
Nice.
Yeah. Once the Academy of North Salem was established in Westchester County in 1790, Jonathan pulled his son out of grammar school in the city and enrolled him in the school closer to home. As noted by Irwin, quote, though the number of those who boarded there must have been small, the caliber of the students of the Academy of North Salem was high, and many boys who attended this school became eminent in later life. Now, it was during this time in the academy that Daniel, who had only been baptized as Daniel Tompkins, began to insert the initial D between his first and last name. So the D just stands for D.
There's no significance to it. It's just an extra letter.
Just an extra letter.
All right. So my nickname, I think, holds true.
Yes.
DDT.
DDT. Old DDT. So Daniel lived and studied there and enjoyed the rural setting, reminiscing later about, quote, the enticements of hunting, angling, and the like, which the country affords. But in 1792, it was time for Daniel to graduate to the next level of educational study, and he was accepted into Columbia College, joining in the sophomore class. Columbia at this time was just a one-building institution with about 80 students, situated on Church Street between Barclay and Murray. Daniel took a little time to adjust to being in what to him was a big city, but soon he was quite engaged in his studies, though he did express a displeasure at the emphasis that Columbia made on Greek and Latin in their curriculum. Thinking that he needed more experience with writing, he joined a literary society, but finding it inadequate as the only critique came from fellow students, he put forward a proposal to use the society fees to contract a formal literary critic to review their work. Now, in his writing while at Columbia, Tompkins wrote essays on a number of topics. One regular subject of note in his essays was slavery. Tompkins would be a lifelong opponent of slavery, and in these college essays asserted that the American quote-unquote struggle for liberty would remain incomplete so long as people were enslaved in the nation. He denounced slavery as, quote, savage barbarity.
All right. I like this guy.
Yeah, so he's off to a good start here, got a good head on his shoulders. Tompkins also expressed his opposition to war with Native peoples and his opposition to capital punishment.
All right.
In a bit of irony that will become clear later, Tompkins also wrote disapprovingly of drunkenness.
Interesting. Based on what I read.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll talk about that later.
Yes. Tompkins attended law lectures and got involved in the politics of New York City during his time at Columbia and was described during this phase of his life as follows, quote, highly intelligent and well-educated, he, Tompkins, showed an unaffected fondness for people, a decidedly democratic outlook, and a remarkable faculty for recollecting the names and faces of persons he even met casually.
Wow.
Now, this didn't mean, however, that it was all work and no play for Tompkins. While in college, he started paying calls at the home of Hannah Minthorn, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Hannah was 7 years younger than Daniel and was described as having, quote, charm, intelligence, tact, wealth, family background, and a father who was a power in the public life of New York.
All right.
So, between his own father and this guy, let's see what happens.
Power family.
Power family. With his graduation on May 6, 1795, during which Daniel was awarded the honor of delivering the valedictory oration, Tompkins decided that the law would be his path into politics and aimed his career trajectory there. Tompkins gained admission to the bar in 1797 and served briefly as attorney and counselor in the Court of Common Pleas in New York and Westchester County. Then, on February 20th, 1798, he and Hannah Minthorn were wed. Tompkins' new father-in-law was a prominent leader in the local Democratic Republican Party as well as the Tammany Society, which would give Tompkins a leg up in getting his start in politics. Now, he had a golden opportunity in the New York General Assembly election of 1800, which where Aaron Burr, which we covered in his episode of the special series, engineered what would prove to be a winning ticket to ensure a Democratic-Republican majority in the state legislature, which, in turn, delivered a guaranteed victory for Jefferson and his to-be-determined running mate. So that's all going on at this time.
All right.
Now, Tompkins worked in his ward, the 7th Ward, to build up support for the Democratic-Republican candidate. But funny enough, due to the strict property ownership qualifications for suffrage in New York at the time, when he initially got involved in the campaign, Tompkins himself was ineligible to vote. So he's working on a campaign that he can't even vote in.
And why was he ineligible to vote?
Because at that point, you had to have so much property in order to have the right to vote.
Gotcha.
And he didn't.
Very interesting.
Thus, he and 30 or so other young Democratic Republicans got the idea of pooling their money to equal $2,000, which they used after forming an association to purchase a house and thus become eligible to vote.
Wow.
So, Tompkins' campaign efforts made him a household name in the ward, and even beyond the initial electoral victory, promised to pay off in dividends for the budding young Politica. In 1801, Tompkins served as a counselor in both the Mayor's Court and the State Supreme Court, as well as a commissioner of bankruptcy in the case of traders for the federal government. However, his most important position politically came towards the end of the year, because both Daniel and his father Jonathan were chosen as delegates to the New York State Constitutional Convention that started on October 13, 1801 in Albany, and both would support Governor George Clinton's position that he should have total control over making nominations to state government positions, rather than the limits that had been put in place through the Council of Appointment. And so we talked about that and Clinton's struggle in that regard in his episode, of course. They would, however, end up being on the losing side of the debate. Tompkins also chimed in on a push to limit the number of members to the state Senate in order to deprive Federalist seats. Daniel saw this as an unfair power grab and submitted an alternate plan to have the voters choose 4 Federalists and 4 Democratic Republicans to lose their seats in the Senate. So even though he thought, let's go ahead and cut the number of members, he didn't think that it should just be Federalists who were removed.
Right. Yeah.
Tompkins' plan put him on the political map in the state, even attracting the notice of one of the leading Federalists in New York. Can you guess who this is?
What was that joker's name?
Has a musical.
Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, yeah.
Here we go with Hamilton had to show up at some point.
Of course he did.
So less than a year later, Tompkins was elected to the state legislature after his unanimous nomination by a committee looking for a candidate who was acceptable to both the Burr and Clinton camps in New York. So he was seen as being this compromise candidate. In early 1804, Tompkins would gain yet another office as he became a solicitor in the U.S. Circuit Court. Now, upon the election of Morgan Lewis as governor of New York that year, Tompkins was nominated by the new state executive to the state Supreme Court as an associate justice. And this nomination was supported by state Democratic Republicans and Federalists alike. So he's now on the state Supreme Court.
Okay.
So quick rise.
Very quick. Very quick.
Now, Daniel threw himself into this work and was described by later historians reviewing his papers as being, quote, known for punctuality, fidelity to duty, for the patience he bestowed upon all matters of trifling detail that came before the court, for the earnest consideration he gave to all questions, for strict impartiality, and for the justice and accuracy of his decisions. So his work as an attorney meant that he was already familiar with many of the cases coming before the court when he joined it, but he often deferred his opinion when he had been a legal counsel in cases to avoid a conflict of interest.
Right. Fair.
This did not stop him from weighing in, however, on cases where he had a political interest that could also constitute a conflict of interest.
Okay.
So if he was involved, if he had been a legal counsel, then he deferred, he went ahead and recused himself. But where it may benefit him politically or his ideologies, he would still act.
Interesting. So with that, he's not a saint per se, but he's still somewhat virtuous. I mean, in the modern context, he would be a saint, I guess, but
yeah. The bar is kind of low.
Yeah. Conga line low.
But yes, he at least, he had some principles.
Yeah.
In his political rise, Tompkins increasingly saw a vested interest in aligning himself closer to the faction headed by New York Governor George Clinton and his nephew DeWitt Clinton. So
P-Funk.
He's in with P-Funk.
He's in with P-Funk.
Though 1804 also saw Tompkins elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, he declined to take up that office, opting instead to remain on the state Supreme Court. And indeed, Tompkins was beginning to do well for himself. Between 1804 and 1807, records show that he purchased at least 10 parcels of land in New York City. Irwin speculates that he may have been helped in this by his father-in-law, and indeed, the Tompkins family lived closer to Hannah's father, Mangle. So her father was named Mangle.
Mangle?
Mangle.
Oh, Mangle.
M-A-N-G-L-E.
Oh. Ooh.
Mangle Menthol.
Mangle, man. All right.
That's a name, huh?
That's definitely does not roll off the tongue.
Luckily, they decided when their first kids came, none of them were named Mangle.
No, I would hope not.
So the Tompkins were indeed a family at this point, with the birth of Arietta in 1800, Griffin in 1801, Anna in 1803, and then in 1805, their fourth child, Sarah, was born.
All right.
Tompkins also got more involved with social life in New York City at the time, including being involved in the establishment of the now prestigious New York Historical Society in December 1804 and serving on its first standing committee. In 1805, Tompkins got involved with a group of citizens in New York City who were concerned about the lack of educational opportunities available for children from less affluent families, and the group obtained a charter for their society, which soon gathered enough funds to establish a school on donated land in May 1806. Pupils could attend this school for free, and soon enough, the number of students increased and more buildings were added. So he's actually helping to found free public education.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. 1805 also saw Tompkins appointed as a judge of the U.S. District Court in New York, but he also declined this office at the federal level. For the moment, Tompkins was content where he was at, as he explained in a letter to Secretary of State James Madison. It was clear, however, that his star was on the rise. Due to his realignment with the Clinton faction in the New York political scene and Morgan Lewis's falling out with the Clintons, as he was more closely aligned with the Livingstons, who the Clintons were yet again at odds with that faction. So you remember back in George Clinton's episode, they just they were friends, they were enemies, friends again, back and forth. Fickle. So this is happening. Yes. All right. Very fickle. So because of that, the Clintons were in search of a new candidate and decided they couldn't do worse than the 32-year-old Tompkins. Thus, on February 16, 1807, Tompkins was officially nominated by the Democratic-Republican caucus as governor, with the incumbent Lieutenant Governor John Broome as his running mate. Lewis drew support from both the Livingstons and the Federalists, but as described by Tompkins' biographer Irwin, this was a campaign in which, quote, there were no real issues, merely partisan appeals by each faction for the support of the electorate. This thus positioned, quote-unquote, the farmer's boy Tompkins well, as he had a good reputation around the state and had a likable personality. So they really drew on this idea that, he was from a farm. He was the farmer's boy. Now, a side note here, one of the ardent supporters of Tompkins in this campaign was another young politico named Martin Van Buren, that we'll talk much more about in this series as well as the narrative series and the Seat at the Table series. He's going to get episodes in all of those, so stay tuned for him.
Okay.
Tompkins would ultimately win the campaign with just over 35,000 votes to Lewis's nearly 31,000. Now, it should be remarked that this was the first time in New York state history that a person was elected to the governorship, quote, without personal wealth or important family connections. So I kind of push back on that a little bit. It does seem like he had at least some wealth. He wasn't Clinton wealthy.
Right.
And he wasn't part of the big factions, but he did at least have some political connections and some money.
Right. He did. But I mean, the fact that he had to, go in with these other people to acquire property so that he would be eligible to vote. He wasn't a land baron by any stretch. So
yeah,
it's all relative, I guess.
Yeah. But regardless, he's governor.
He's
Yay!
Governor. Hurrah.
Tompkins finished out his last bit of circuit riding as an associate justice of the state Supreme Court and, on Wednesday, July 1st, 1807, made his way to Albany to take office as the fourth governor of the state of New York. Now, as we discussed in Clinton's episode, due to how long Clinton served as governor, this meant that in a 30-year period, only John Jay and Morgan Lewis had also had the opportunity to be governor prior to Tompkins' inauguration.
Wow. And how many years did
Clinton
serve?
So I think it was 6 terms.
Ooh, wow. That's a lot.
I believe so.
P-Funk didn't want to leave the stage. And
well,
that's pretty apropos.
And remember, he left for a little bit and then they brought him back.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Irwin notes that during the first year of his governorship, DeWitt Clinton likely exerted a good amount of influence. Indeed, DeWitt saw Tompkins as his ticket to resume a seat on the Council of Appointment, as well as his position as mayor of New York City. Meanwhile, Hannah would begin to play a role in the budding Tompkins administration as she presided over the social life at the governor's mansion. Their family would also continue to grow as a 5th child was born in December 1807. Guess what his name was?
Daniel.
Think about the other name that we talked about.
Oh, Mangle?
He was named Mangle Menthorn after his grandfather.
Oh, my Lord.
I think they should have stuck with finding other names.
They should have,
Or Mangle.
Initials or something, I mean, man.
So now he's Eminem.
Okay. Hey.
Mangle Menthorn Tompkins.
MMT.
MMT. The couple would have 3 more children. Daniel Hyatt, who was born in 1810, Susan McLaren, born in 1812, and Ray, born in 1814.
See, I was right about Daniel. It was coming.
Yeah.
So, all right.
They have to have a Daniel.
Yeah.
And they apparently also have a Ray.
Okay.
Just Ray.
Just Ray.
Just Ray. As the family continued to grow, as there was no official governor's mansion at the time, the Tompkins would sometimes move house to have more room. Tompkins would find furnishing these homes to be a large additional expense, to the point that in early 1812, he had to sell some of his real estate holdings in New York City.
To furnish the house?
To furnish the house.
Putting down gold flake or something? What?
Well, at the time, it was expected that the governor was supposed to have a nice house and nice things. You know, he couldn't just, it couldn't just be like back on the farm.
Okay, if you say so.
You're like, I just have a simple table.
I've seen the style colonial architecture or in furnishings, and it's not all that. So I don't know why it would cost that much, but that's just me.
But anyway, so he had to furnish these houses, and so he had to sell some land for that. Hannah would take the kids at times for extended stays with her parents in New York City, and the Menthorns, in turn, would travel up to Albany to visit with the Tompkins family. Tompkins would hire tutors for the children, and occasionally the tutors would live in the household. Tompkins' gubernatorial term began with news of the Chesapeake Leopard affair, which is where a Royal Navy ship attacked and boarded a U.S. Navy vessel and took 4 folks claimed to be deserters from the British Navy. Needless to say, this immediately caused an uproar in the U.S. and a diplomatic crisis. New York, as a state housing a key mercantile post for the nation and sharing an extended border with British-held territory, felt the pressure immediately, and the governor would have to respond. The town of Champlain submitted a request for arms being made available to their community as they were on the Canadian border. And though Tompkins complied with their request, quote, as far as a due regard to other places equally exposed and defenseless, he also explained that, quote, the governor is not by any law expressly authorized to remove arms and ammunition from our arsenals, except in case of actual invasion. So he was basically saying, I understand you're freaked out. Canada is right there, and they're not invading. It's not that serious. Cool your jets.
Okay.
Soon after, Tompkins would have to deal with the ramifications of Jefferson's embargo on all foreign trade. Given New York's dependence on said trade, it can be understood why the measure was quite unpopular in the Empire State. Tompkins, however, in his first message to the state legislature on January 26, 1808, would come out as a staunch defender of Jefferson and the embargo. As Tompkins stated in this address, quote,
what patriotic citizen will murmur at the temporary privations and inconveniences resulting from this measure when he reflects upon the vast expenditure of national treasure, the sacrifices of lives of our countrymen, the total and permanent suspension of commerce, the corruption of morals, and the distress and misery consequent upon our being in the war between the nations of Europe? The evils which threaten us call for magnanimous confidence in the efforts of our national councils to avert them, and for a firm and unanimous determination to devote everything that is dear to us to maintain our rights and national honor.
This support of the federal administration's policy, however, would put Tompkins at odds with DeWitt Clinton, who would quickly come out in opposition to the embargo and would soon after oppose Jefferson's chosen successor, Secretary of State James Madison, for the presidency in the 1808 presidential election. Rather than supporting DeWitt's push for New York's electors to choose his uncle, Vice President George Clinton, Tompkins argued that the VP's chances were slim to none of winning, and that such a move would instead just isolate New York from having an influence in the Madison administration. So you remember in Clinton's episode, 1808 came out, and DeWitt Clinton was pushing his uncle to run for the presidency. But Tompkins is like, Madison's going to get it. Nobody's going to oppose Jefferson's choice. We need to have an end with the administration. We're going to need stuff from the federal government. So cool it. Again,
right.
Before long, all of the anti-Clintonian opposition factions in the New York political scene would rally around Tompkins and work to widen the rift between him and the Clintons. Indeed, even Tompkins' father-in-law, Mangle Minthorn, I'm going to say Mangle as many times as possible, Mangle Minthorn got into the fray in the effort to defeat the Clintons. Tompkins, however, would not openly break with the Clintons and maintained a good relationship with DeWitt in spite of the efforts of his supporters. This did not mean, however, that Tompkins was just a passive bystander in this political shift. His biographer Irwin asserts that, quote, Tompkins understood the possibilities that the Embargo Act and DeWitt Clinton's hostility to it held for him. He could not hope to become the real leader of the Clinton group, and to defy the Clintons without aid from the national administration would sooner or later result in political disaster. On the other hand, the combination of circumstances existing in 1808 offered him a way out. He must support Jefferson and the embargo. To do this was a step toward freedom from political subservience to the Clintons. So he sees in this an opportunity for him. He got his rise because the Clintons were looking for somebody. Now he wants to be the one in charge, and he knows that he's going to need support. Who's bigger than the Clintons? The federal government,
Right.
the Jeffersonians.
Right.
Tompkins would take command of both the regular and militia forces on the New York frontier, quote, with a view to using them in assisting civil and revenue officers with enforcing the Embargo Act, something made doubly complicated with the port and the border. The federal and state governments would both face staunch opposition to the embargo, and though Tompkins didn't always agree with the Jefferson administration's stance in terms of the details of enforcement, he would still align himself with the administration and coordinate with them accordingly. Tompkins also reported back to the federal government on some of the revenue officials at ports around the state who were either actively working against the embargo or proved ineffective to the task of enforcing it. So being on the ground, he could be the eyes and ears for the administration. Hey, we got somebody who's not doing right. You may want to get rid of them.
Right.
On January 27th, 1809, Clinton would finally pay heed to Tompkins's warnings and introduce resolutions in the U.S. Senate in support of the embargo at a time that it was being denounced across the nation. While this would have little effect in terms of support for the embargo, as it was repealed right before Jefferson's term ended on March 4th, it did at least put DeWitt back in the good graces of the incoming administration and prominent New York Democratic Republicans. Still, it would prove to be Tompkins who came out of this point acting as, quote, the bridge for the political gap between the republicanism of the North and that of the South. His influence with the federal administration grew exponentially through the coordination that he did with them during the embargo, and this would continue on into the Madison administration. Likewise, the strong stance that he took on the issue was admired by some key figures in New York and enhanced his position in the state, especially since the embargo didn't prove quite as ruinous for the state economy as some had feared, as it stimulated domestic manufacturing in the Empire State. All of this would come in handy as the next gubernatorial election neared. So, with the embargo, Federalists in New York had seen a brief resurgence. And though the Tompkins and Clinton factions weren't as close as they had been, they were still forced into an alliance to ensure another term for the sitting Democratic-Republican governor. The Clintonians figured Tompkins was at least the devil they knew.
Yeah.
It's like, do you want a Federalist or do you want this guy?
Yeah.
Federalists would put up Jonas Platt of Herkimer as their candidate. Platt was described by Irwin as, quote, a fighting frontier lawyer-statesman who had displayed some forensic ability in his denunciations of the embargo in 1809. When it came to the campaign in 1810, however, quote, his intemperate and biased language, in sharp contrast to Tompkins's more carefully considered criticism of both Britain and France, served only to expose Platt to the Republican charge that the Federalists were defending the interest of Britain rather than those of the United States. They're like, this guy is just going off.
He's going crazy.
Tompkins won handily with a vote of just over 43,000 to Platt's nearly 36,500.
Okay.
And his coattails allowed the Democratic Republicans to take control of both houses of the state legislature, as well as to indirectly allow DeWitt Clinton to take back the mayorship of New York City. Clinton, however, was intended for bigger and better things.
Of course.
And when incumbent Lieutenant Governor John Broome passed away in February 1811, it was Clinton who was chosen as his successor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this new position brought an added wrinkle to the precarious relationship between Tompkins and the Clintonians, as it put DeWitt in a prime position to take more indirect charge of the political forces in the state and reminded folks of Tompkins' past as a servant of the Clinton machine in the state. So, having Clinton so close was seen as a detriment to Tompkins. Tompkins' supporters, including his father-in-law, Mangle Minthorn,
Mangle,
would respond, and Minthorn led a meeting in early February 1811 which, quote, passed a set of resolutions reciting Clinton's deviations from the party's policies and attributed his political irregularities to a desire to establish a Clinton family aristocracy centering in his own person. In short, the passing of the resolutions amounted to an attempt to read Clinton out of the party. This led to a pro-Clintonian effort to attack Minthorn directly, accusing him of working with the British for his own financial gain during the Revolution. So things are really starting to heat up between the Tompkins supporters and the Clinton supporters. Now, though Clinton had forged an alliance with Madison and Tompkins, his ultimate goal was the presidency. And he would even reach out to Federalists in this effort. By this point, however, Tompkins was firmly in the pro-Madison camp. In particular, the governor maintained a close working relationship and lengthy correspondence with the president's right-hand man at the time, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. On behalf of the administration, Gallatin would seek out Tompkins' opinion on federal appointments in the state, while Tompkins would continue to provide the administration with updates on what was happening on the ground. Now, in addition to his work as governor, Tompkins served as Chancellor of the Board of Regents for the Free School Society that we discussed earlier, starting in February 1808. He would use his enhanced platform as governor to promote the cause of popular education. In his annual address in 1810, Tompkins spoke about the need of providing proper education, quote, for the rising generation, as described by his biographer Irwin, and said as follows, quote,
competent provision for their education is all essential to enable them to perceive and duly to estimate their rights, to inculcate correct principles and habits of morality and religion, and thus to render them useful citizens.
Now, it would take a bit to work out the details, but Tompkins was at least able to see through a school law in 1812, which provided for the election of town commissioners, quote, to establish school districts with elected trustees, and for, quote, the schools to be supported both by state grants and local taxation, as well as the establishment of a state superintendent of education. So he's really pushing education in New York.
Yeah.
Tompkins also worked closely with the superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point to advocate for greater support from the federal government for the institution in order to ensure that it would not, as Superintendent Williams advocated, move out of the state to Washington, D.C. Tompkins saw clear advantages to retaining the academy in New York, though he was also willing to concede a move to Staten Island, which may better position the academy to tap into resources in New York City. So he's like, if you're going to move anywhere, why not move close to New York City? Tompkins even toured a site on Staten Island with Secretary of War William Eustis. But as seen in Eustis's Seat at the Table episode, he struggled to provide strong leadership to the War Department, even in peacetime. So this didn't happen. Of course, we know the military academy is still at West Point. Now, as governor, Tompkins also worked to reform the state's criminal justice system to ensure that it was more just and less focused on severe punishments that didn't match the crime. In particular, Tompkins advocated for the end of flogging as a criminal punishment. And yes, even in the early 19th century, that was apparently a thing.
Wow. Okay.
Tompkins asserted that, quote,
reason and experience abundantly testify that no reformation can be wrought by the agonies of a lacerated body, for the publicity and ignominy of the punishment will stifle every remnant of pride and ambition and destroy the prospect of ever regaining a character.
So Tompkins was focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment and making an example of someone, rather than punishment and making an example of someone who had committed a crime. So, and we saw this in his time in college, that these are issues that he's been thinking about for quite a while.
Yeah. Imagine that. I mean, rehabilitation.
Rehabilitation, education.
Yeah.
Actually helping to build people up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tompkins also called for the expansion of support for mental health facilities, as well as the abolition of slavery in New York and better treatment of Native peoples in the western part of the state.
Nice.
However, Tompkins' advocacy for domestic reforms would also have to compete with his response to larger events playing out around the same time. So even though he does have this focus on domestic issues, there's also some other stuff going on, because the drums of war were beginning to beat as 1811 gave way to 1812, and some saw this as the perfect opportunity to profit.
Oh, goodness.
So then, as now, New York was a big center for banking, and in January 1812, Federalists in the state assembly introduced a bill calling for the incorporation of a new bank, the Bank of America, and no, not
the
that
same one.
Bank of
Right.
America, which was to have a capital of $6 million, and in exchange for the state not chartering any new banks for 20 years, would pay the state $600,000, with 2/3 of that fund going into the Common School Fund, while the rest was split between the Literature Fund to support higher education and 1/6 to go straight into the state treasury.
Mm-hmm.
And if that wasn't enough, the bank would sweeten the pot with an agreement to loan the state $1 million at 5% interest to build canals, as well as another $1 million at 6% interest to support agricultural improvements in the state. So all that sounds good, right?
Yeah, it sounds good.
But this mammoth bank, as it was called, greatly worried Tompkins. And he said as such in his address to the state legislature on January 28th. He knew the situation on the ground. There were already tons of other banks in New York. Did they really need one more? Tompkins also warned that other banks had promised the moon before, but had gone back on their promises. Was this a deal too good to be true? Good question.
Very good question.
Now, despite his warnings and with rumors of, shall we say, inducements being provided to assemblymen to vote in favor of the measure, little under the table.
Yeah.
The lower house of the legislature passed the bill, and it was sent to the state Senate. In an attempt to get more time to lobby against the bill's passage, Tompkins decided to employ a to that point unused power, which was granted to the governor of New York. He prorogued the legislature for 60 days, which meant that their work was temporarily suspended.
Wow. Okay.
So he's like, you're not debating anything because prorogued.
Wow. Okay.
Now, in the message announcing the proroguing, Tompkins wrote as follows, quote,
far be it from me to insinuate that improper considerations have induced any member to vote for the said bill. Yet should its final passage now take place, before the persons implicated in holding out the before-mentioned inducements shall have been judicially tried, and without consulting the feelings and opinion of the community at large upon the subject, public sentiment will, I fear, however unjustly, attribute its passage, in some degree, to the influence of such inducements.
So basically, he is calling them out. He is saying
about it.
You have been caught with your hands in the cookie jar.
Big time. Crumbs all over.
And everybody knows it. Everybody's going to see it. What do you think they're going to think about this? Tompkins knew such inducements had been freely distributed as they had been in the chartering of other banks by the state legislature, and he used that to his advantage to try to derail the chartering of the Mammoth Bank. Naturally, This drew a protest from Democratic Republicans who had voted for the bank bill. These, however, were drowned out by the many testimonials in support of Tompkins' stance on the issue. So they're like, no, we just like the bank. It's fine. Everybody's like, no, we believe the governor.
Mm-hmm.
He still had to be concerned, however, about the potential split in the state party over the issue. In particular, Lieutenant Governor DeWitt Clinton, who was angling to challenge Madison for the presidency, was waffling on the issue and trying to play a fine line. So Tompkins didn't want to say one way or the other. And, you think about the governor in the best little house in Texas.
Oh, yeah. You're right.
Trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Woo! So this meant that Tompkins, who was already committed to Madison, had to tread carefully to avoid a complete party rupture. In a subtle move, though written in a confidential letter, Tompkins informed a highly influential state politico on April 6th that, quote, suspicions seem to be entertained in New York that the lieutenant governor has either been friendly to or silent about the bank. Rest assured, my dear sir, great injustice is done him by such insinuations. He has uniformly been as decided, steady, and open in his opposition to the bank as I have been, and has, I really believe, interested himself more and taken greater pains to convince members of the impropriety of voting for it than I've done. Confidential. Sure.
Right.
Yeah, this is his way of saying, okay, you're not going to take a stand? Well, I'm going to say that you're taking a stand. And people are going to believe me because, I'm the one who's called out all this mess.
Mm-hmm.
Despite Tompkins' best efforts, however, on May 21st, when the state legislature resumed their business, the Senate passed the bill chartering the Mammoth Bank.
Oh, my goodness.
Tompkins still had one last hope, however, the Council of Revision. As described by Tompkins' biographer Irwin, quote, the council, composed of the governor, chancellor, and 5 members of the Supreme Court, could revise bills or subject them to a suspensive veto after passage by the legislature. Now, Tompkins personally appealed to Chancellor John Lansing Jr. to try to prevent the passage of the bill, as Lansing was seen as being the swing vote, but Lansing ultimately voted for it. Though the bank received its charter, as Tompkins had feared, the promised benefits for the state failed to materialize. The original promised bonus of $600,000 was scaled back to $100,000.
Oh, man.
So, with war with Britain increasingly probable as his term as governor went on, Tompkins did what he could to prepare himself. As he did not have a formal military background, he did what he could to gather information about the present state of defenses and what could be done to better prepare New York for war. Unfortunately for Tompkins, where things stood was not necessarily a good place.
Mm-mm.
As described by Irwin, quote, the militia system as it existed up to the outbreak of the War of 1812 was so indefinite, even chaotic, that it scarcely merited the designation of system at all. So that's not a good way to start.
Not really.
Thus, it would be dependent on Tompkins as governor to, quote, supply information to militia officers about their authority and duties, as well as to engage in, quote, an extensive correspondence with federal officials regarding the confused relationship existing between state and federal jurisdiction in military matters. So this is one of those things, and it comes out of the Revolution, and we kind of saw this with George Clinton's episode, that even though there are state militia forces, there are federal military forces, it's all kind of a mishmash, and there aren't clear delineations between where one stops and the other begins. It's more about just doing the thing. So he's trying to figure this out. As Tompkins wrote in December 1811, quote,
it is certainly desirable that a national system of discipline and tactics for the militia and regulars should be devised and sanctioned by Congress. Until something of that kind be done, we may expect to have a great many ignorant officers in both corps, and of course, some very indifferent troops.
Tompkins also worked in the years leading up to the war to push for the, quote, construction of arsenals and fortifications together with the manufacture and distribution of arms, ammunition, and other military equipment wherever needed throughout the state. And this is a big job. Just look at a map of the state of New York and think in those days, transportation infrastructure was not in place. And so this was a big job. The governor also coordinated with the state legislature and the U.S. War Department to purchase land for military bases to be constructed. Tompkins went so far as to cover one of the purchases with his own private funds until such time as the state legislature could make an appropriation for the purchase. So he is not just giving his time, his effort, he is putting his own personal funds into this effort because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Tompkins also had to prepare the citizens of the state for the conflict to come. Thus, he said as follows in one of his messages to the state legislature in the lead up to war, quote,
"Experience has at length taught us the feeble reliance which is to be reposed on appeals to the veracity, the magnanimity, or the justice of monarchs, and has dissipated every remaining gleam of hope that our neutral rights will be respected."
So as expected, in June 1812, Congress declared war. Despite all of his efforts at coordinating with the federal government, when the war began, Tompkins, quote, was left uninformed by the War Department as to what plan of operations the administration proposed to pursue in the event of war, or even whether it had formulated and adopted any plan. Now, for listeners who listened to the William Eustace episode of the Seat at the Table series, you'll know, there wasn't a plan.
Is there ever?
Certainly not this time.
Okay.
Likewise, despite the efforts he had made towards preparedness, Tompkins would lead a state that was sharply divided over whether they should be at war to begin with, and he was well aware of the logistical challenges that he faced. As described by Irwin, quote, "The frontier to be guarded was not only tremendous in extent, but exposed both to sea and to land attack. Roads were bad and transportation poor. Furthermore, although there were more than 95,000 New York militiamen subject to be called into service, most of them were poorly trained, equipped, and officered." So Tompkins tasked Lieutenant Governor DeWitt Clinton as head of the Commissioners of Fortifications with the task of securing, quote, "the northern and western frontiers," sending him a draft for $25,000 for the purpose, and asserting, quote, "that until the upstate areas were secure, he would not be justified in leaving them." So he's telling Clinton, get to work.
Get to work.
We've got some important things to do. I'm doing what I can here, but I'm going to need you to secure the frontier.
Yeah.
While shuttling between Albany to deal with state business and New York City to direct defense preparations in the early days of the war, Tompkins would receive word of one American failure after another. In late September and October 1812, Tompkins traveled to various points on the northwestern frontier, including Sackett's Harbor, Oswego, and Buffalo. For the first point on the itinerary, Sackett's Harbor, Tompkins was accompanied by the new commander of naval forces on Lakes Erie and Ontario, Commodore Isaac Chauncey, and would be present when Chauncey took command. And of course, check out our narrative series on the Madison presidency. Chauncey shows up and he doesn't really do so well.
Chauncey.
Tompkins would also be on hand to witness the failure of the American invasion of Canada across the Niagara River in October and would see firsthand the quote-unquote scene of confusion on the ground before returning to Albany in early November with information to share with state and federal government officials. Indeed, as he wrote to a New York militia officer, quote,
"I did not, indeed, could not anticipate such a scene of gasconading and of subsequent imbecility and folly as General Smythe has exhibited. To compare the events of the recent campaign with those of the days of the Revolution is almost enough to convince one that the race of brave men and able commanders will before many years become extinct." Wow.
Yeah.
All right. That doesn't sound too encouraging.
No, it was a dark time, and especially with him being in New York State, because even though they would eventually start to see some advances in the West, the Niagara frontier, that front of the war, was never good. So 1812 also meant that Tompkins had to walk a political tightrope as DeWitt Clinton ran for president against Madison, and Democratic Republicans in New York were split. The state legislative caucus had voted for Clinton's presidential nomination in May, and Tompkins's continued support for the Madison administration opened him up to attacks from Clinton's supporters in the state. Now, though Clinton ended up winning New York, he lost the election by a vote of 128 electoral votes for Madison versus 89 for Clinton. Now, despite Clinton's win in the Empire State, it was clear that his defeat in his bid for the presidency hurt him politically. In February 1813, when Democratic-Republican members of the state legislature came together to nominate candidates for governor and lieutenant governor, Tompkins was unanimously put forward for another term in the former office. But in the nomination for the lower half of the ticket, 32 votes were cast for John Taylor, while only 16 were cast for Clinton.
P-Funk, you got to let it go, man. That doesn't sound good.
This is P-Funk 2.0, DeWitt Clinton.
This is the atomic dog, let me tell you.
See, this isn't P-Funk, this is just funk.
Yeah.
Little funk.
Little funk.
So Federalists put forward General Stephen Van Rensselaer as their gubernatorial candidate and focused their campaign against Tompkins on his war record and, in particular, his treatment of Van Rensselaer and other Federalist generals. Ultimately, these attacks would prove hollow, and Tompkins was reelected with a majority of over 3,600 votes. So at this point, that is a good amount of votes.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't that many people who were eligible to vote, which, we talked about before, these still archaic rules, property requirements in order to be able to vote, things like that. So in early June, Tompkins traveled to Washington, D.C. to confer with administration officials about the prosecution of the war. However, he was back in Albany by July 1st, where he was sworn in to another term as governor. Tompkins would continue to be frustrated by military losses at the boundaries of New York, despite the support and sometimes ignored advice that he offered the War Department. Tompkins did at least get the chance to fet the hero of the Battle of the Thames, General William Henry Harrison, when he traveled to New York City in late November and early December 1813 on his way to Washington. As 1813 gave way to 1814, Tompkins continued to impress upon administration officials, as well as members of the state congressional delegation, the importance of pushing forward with operations on the Niagara front in western New York. Despite his previous losses, Tompkins urged the appointment of General Henry Dearborn to lead operations in the area. Ultimately, nothing would come of this. But still, Tompkins did at least have a new ally in the war effort in the newly elected legislature, which, without question, provided Tompkins with legislative support far beyond their predecessors. So he's finally got a legislative body that's actually going to work with him. And it was definitely needed because that year proved to be one of strain for the federal government, with the nation's treasury nearly empty and with few prospects available for relief. With this in mind, in order to ensure that New York banks would actually loan money to the federal government, Tompkins personally endorsed the banknotes. As Irwin notes, quote, the governor knew that he was exposing himself to possible financial ruin. Because in endorsing banknotes, and this is what got other folks, we talked about Jefferson and his money issues. By endorsing banknotes, if the party that the banknotes are for don't pay, you're held liable.
Yeah.
So
Not good.
He is personally putting himself at financial risk.
That's devotion.
That's devotion. As noted by Jane Hampton Cook, Tompkins was originally hesitant, but knowing that he had the support of Senator Rufus King, Federalist from New York, who had had side conversations with New York bankers, he did ultimately sign in order to ensure that New York City was properly defended. King was a latecomer to supporting the war, but at this point, it was clear that there was an upswell of support. Towards the end of September, in recognition of his efforts on the administration's behalf, President Madison wrote to Tompkins offering him the position of Secretary of State in his cabinet. Now, Tompkins ultimately declined the honor, asserting that he was more useful to the war effort as governor of New York. But it could have been, however, as Tompkins admitted in a letter a couple of years later, that he was more concerned about the large expense of moving his family to Washington, D.C. In order to take up the post. And especially where he's on kind of this potential financial liability being held. He's not in the best financial state right now.
Yeah.
And so this would be a major expense. We've seen this with other cabinet members that they had problems. So he's like, thanks, but no thanks. Not wanting to completely lose the benefit of his talents, Madison in late October offered him another post closer to home, a non-commissioned command of the 3rd Military District. Now, Tompkins did accept this command and proceeded down to New York City to take charge, a post that he would hold until the end of the war. A close friend of his would also serve as his military aide, someone who you may have heard of, Lieutenant Colonel Washington Irving.
Yeah, that name sounds a little vaguely.
Do you know what Washington Irving is famous for?
I can't say that I know what he's famous for, but I know the name rings a bell.
Sleepy Hollow.
Sleepy Hollow. Yeah. Yeah. I have a friend that lives in Sleepy Hollow, actually.
Yes.
Just north of the city. Right.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
So he would later become famous as an author, but at this point he's serving in the military.
Gotcha.
Now, sadly, the service would begin inauspiciously when, while inspecting Fort Greene in Brooklyn Heights, Tompkins was thrown from his horse and ended up, as described by Irving, quote, lying in the ditch.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Not good.
Not good. But Tompkins would throw himself into the work of inspecting fortifications in his military district and would keep up, quote, an exhausting pace during the closing months of the war. Now, as someone who believed in rehabilitation rather than punishment for misdeeds, and this is something that we talked about earlier, that he wanted to change and reform the criminal justice code. So he believed more in rehabilitation. It is understandable that Tompkins, serving in various courts-martial during his time as commander of the 3rd Military District, was inclined to leniency, even in cases of insubordination or desertion. Tompkins also took personal responsibility in December 1814 for another loan of $400,000 in 1814 dollars.
Wow, that's a lot.
In order to pay militiamen on behalf of the government.
Goodness.
Finally, in mid-February 1815, Tompkins received the order from the War Department that he and all the others had long hoped for. Quote, all military operations were to be suspended, and orders already issued for the calling out of additional troops were to be revoked. At long last, the war was over, and in April, Tompkins was able to resign his command of the 3rd Military District. However, this did not mean that Tompkins thought peace between the U.S. and Britain would be long-lasting. As others did on both sides of the Atlantic, Tompkins was concerned that since the peace treaty did not actually resolve any of the issues between the two nations, so, the Treaty of Ghent, it was status quo antebellum, he felt that there would soon be cause to return to conflict, and thus he kept pushing for preparedness measures in New York as governor. Now, Tompkins was lauded for his leadership of New York during the war. He was taking charge, he was getting things done. People recognized that. And naturally, with a presidential election coming in 1816, Tompkins started to be talked about as a potential candidate. An article in the Albany Argus in January 1816 asserted that, quote, if private worth, if public service, if fervent patriotism and practical talents are to be regarded in selecting a president, then Governor Tompkins stands forth to the nation with unrivaled pretensions. This opinion is not rashly pronounced, nor shall it be unaccompanied with the requisite facts to substantiate its correctness. There were others, however, who were more critical of Tompkins' qualifications for the highest office of the land. U.S. Attorney for the District of New York, Jonathan Fisk, wrote to Representative John W. Taylor, Democratic-Republican from New York, on December 31st, 1815, on Tompkins' candidacy for the presidency. Quote, May the day never arrive in the history of this republic when any character, however great and popular, shall be placed in the executive chair who has never had any experience in the general government.
Ooh.
It may do to take green hands from members of Congress, but it would be madness to take such for the executive.
Wow. How is this? How is it that this is relevant today?
How is this relevant today? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we've long since arrived at that day. So
Yes, we have. We have.
Tompkins would be put forward unanimously by Democratic Republican members of the New York State Legislature as their candidate for president, and the legislature also urged the U.S. congressional delegation to give their support to Tompkins as well. But just in case things shouldn't work out with the presidential nomination, however, the Legislative Caucus also nominated Tompkins for another term as governor. Now, Tompkins was a bit reluctant to accept this latter nomination, but an up-and-coming Politico named Martin Van Buren, who we will talk about in a future episode, would work to convince him to accept the nomination for another term as governor. Indeed, the Democratic-Republican nominating caucus in Washington, D.C. on March 16, 1816, narrowed down between the candidacies of Secretary of State James Monroe and Secretary of War William H. Crawford, with Monroe narrowly coming out on top with 65 votes to 54 for Crawford. So we talked about that in Monroe's episode and Crawford's episode, so I'll refer you to those. But with the top of the ticket decided, they then had to think of a running mate. In this contest, Tompkins officially became the party's nominee for vice president by a vote of 85 to 30 for Governor Simon Schneider of Pennsylvania. So he is now the VP candidate.
VP, yo.
While awaiting the presidential election contest later in the year, the Democratic-Republican gubernatorial race continued steadily along. Federalists put forward Rufus King as their candidate for governor. Now, funny enough, King would also be the Federalist candidate for president that year as well. So both of these candidates for governor are also candidates for higher office. As noted by Irwin, quote, the ensuing campaign was bitter, with the war record of each party and its gubernatorial candidate providing the central theme. Democratic Republicans lauded Tompkins' prosecution of the war, while Federalists accused Tompkins and others in his administration of being, quote, guilty of gross misuse of public funds. Despite the fact that, as Federalists charged, with the governor as the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic-Republican ticket, it was likely he wouldn't serve out the full gubernatorial term if elected, Tompkins would ultimately come out on top with 45,412 votes to King's 38,647.
Nice.
So, decisive victory.
Yeah.
In mid-March, Tompkins explained that the vice presidency was much more of an attractive option for him than a cabinet position in terms of advancing his political career, as it would afford him a better salary while also allowing him to keep his family in New York rather than move them down to Washington, D.C., as he would only be needed in the capital for part of the year. And so we've talked about this with some of the others because there was so much time between congressional sessions. Vice presidents typically didn't own a home or rent a home. They would find some temporary lodging and they would just go down themselves rather than bring their families. Indeed, those debts that he had guaranteed for the federal government were starting to wear on his finances. And Tompkins also shared with his friend that, quote, if the state legislature would grant him a compensation here that would save his private fortune from encroachment, he should prefer to remain here to being vice president. So he's having to start thinking of the money.
Mm-hmm.
He would make more as vice president, but if he didn't have to make as much, maybe he could stay on as governor. Still, when he learned of his nomination, Tompkins accepted it, and in December, it was clear that Monroe and Tompkins, having earned 183 electoral votes each, would be the new president and vice president, respectively. Now, this was a time where the boundaries between the federal and state governments were not as clearly marked. Though Article 1, Section 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution forbids members of Congress from holding other offices while serving in Congress, there was nothing that said that a vice president couldn't also serve as, say, governor of New York.
Right.
Indeed, Martin Van Buren urged Tompkins to stay on as governor after taking his oath of office as vice president. Tompkins, to his credit, realized how problematic that would be logistically as well as politically.
Yeah.
It would not look good.
Wouldn't look good, wouldn't feel good. Good on him.
So he decided he would resign. He did, however, have one more agenda item to attend to. On January 28, 1817, Tompkins sent a special message to the state legislature in which he asserted that, quote,
I will now take the liberty of submitting to the legislature whether the dictates of humanity, the reputation of the state, and a just sense of gratitude to the Almighty for the many favors he has conferred on us as a nation, do not demand that the reproach of slavery be expunged from our statute book. I do, therefore, respectfully but earnestly, recommend to the legislature to establish some future day, not more remote than the 4th day of July, 1827, on which slavery shall cease within this state. To fix a day thus remote for general emancipation will consequently impair in a very small degree any private right and will, at the same time, be consistent with the humanity and justice of a free and prosperous people.
So he is pushing for the end of slavery in New York.
Mm-hmm. Good for him.
Yeah. So I think that's probably going to come back into play when we get to the end.
Yep.
On March 31st, 1817, the legislature approved an act to free all those enslaved who had been born before the 4th of July, 1799, and amended various legal aspects of slavery in New York. While it didn't go as far as Tompkins would have liked, and it would take a bit longer to achieve full emancipation, it was at least a step forward. By the point this bill was passed, however, Tompkins had resigned the governorship on February 24th and had taken his oath of office as the 6th U.S. Vice President. We are going to pause the story of Daniel D. Tompkins here, and we'll pick back up next time with his tenure as Vice President, then on to the end of his life. Then Alex and I will evaluate his legacy and determine if he deserves to preside from the rostrum with the VP All-Stars. I cannot thank Alex enough for joining me for this episode. And until next time, if you'd like to see the sources used for this episode, you can go to the website, presidenciespodcast.com. I'll have those on the page for this episode on the website. At the website, you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more information about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. I cannot thank our patrons enough. All of you are wonderful. You have supported this podcast. You've helped us to grow, and I cannot thank you enough. I also wanted to thank those who have fulfilled books on my research wish list. Your assistance with this helps to ensure to have the resources that I need on hand to make this as deep of a dive as I can, to make sure that it is well researched and that I'm bringing all the information that I can to you. So thank you so much. Thanks for all who have left ratings and reviews wherever you can do that for podcasting platforms where that is available. I cannot thank you enough. And for those who have shared information about presidencies on your social media, or you've just told somebody in your life who you know is a presidential history fanatic like me, I cannot thank you enough for helping to spread the word. Word of mouth is still the best advertisement ever. So thank you so much for helping me to get the word out there. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. I can also be found on social media if you don't follow me there already. I'm available on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I cannot thank you enough for listening. I have greatly enjoyed our journey through vice presidential history thus far, and so I hope you'll join us to wrap up Tompkins, and then we've got a big one coming up. That's right, John C. Calhoun. He's next after Tompkins. But believe me, you'll want to come back for Tompkins because there is so much there, and even though spoiler alert, he does make it through his vice presidency, it's a bit of a rocky tenure. So come back next time and find out more. But until next time, Stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another. And take care, dear friends.
Doug. Here we have the Limu Emu in its natural habitat, helping people customize their car insurance and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Fascinating. It's accompanied by his natural ally, Doug.
Limu? Is that guy with the binoculars watching us?
Cut the camera. They see us.
Only pay for what you need at libertymutual.com.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Savings vary. Underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and affiliates. Excludes Massachusetts.